Another issue that was alluded to by Ambassador Hasuna last night in his comments was this whole issue of how does the United States re-engage with the international community? What type of public diplomacy would be involved in that objective? And our next panel is going to be dealing with this whole question of public diplomacy under the new administration and how it should be shaped, how it should be formed. So I'm delighted to turn the podium over to my colleague from the Sanford Institute, soon to be School of Public Policy, Professor Bruce Jentleson. Bruce, over to you.
Thanks very much, Scott. This is always a pleasure to participate in these conferences. Scott and his team, I know, do such a really extraordinary job, both substantively and logistically. Our panel today seems to come at the right moment in the conference from the way things have been progressing. We chose the title intentionally, Public Diplomacy from Rhetoric to Strategy, because public diplomacy is a term that is very often invoked, especially post 9/11, and especially with reference to the Arab and Islamic world. As I'm sure we'll discuss, public diplomacy predates 9/11, and many aspects deal not only with the Arab and Islamic world, but that has been, I think, the precipitant of much work. Indeed, one recent study done of public diplomacy identified 34 selected reports in an appendix, and that was selected, all of which had appeared since 2001, and 16 major proposals that have been made in Congress and elsewhere. So we know that we think public diplomacy is important. But I think the questions we want to address in this panel are, what is public diplomacy? If it's all things to all people, it kind of loses its definition and makes it very hard to budget for, to have a strategy, to measure impact and the like. What can it accomplish? It is not the only aspect, far from it, of our engagements with the world. And how to do it so that it does accomplish what it's capable of accomplishing. It involves the U.S. government, and indeed many branches of the U.S. government. I think it was just the other day that the Obama administration named its nominee for the new Undersecretary of State for Public Diplomacy, but it involves many other parts of the government. It involves the private sector, and it involves our civil society as well. And our panel really embodies some of this diversity. So what I'd like to do now is introduce the three members of the panel, and then ask each of them to speak, and we're going to limit our remarks so that we have time for questions and discussion. We're going to start with Keith Reinhard, who is Chairman Emeritus of DDB Worldwide Advertising Agency, and is here particularly in his capacity as President of a group, Business for Diplomatic Action. This is a group, in fact, two of us, Helle and I, serve in advisory capacities to this group. But it's doing very, very interesting work that Keith will talk about with the American business community, indeed the international business community, under this broad rubric of public diplomacy. He's had a very distinguished career in the business world. As chairman of DDB Worldwide, it's among the largest global advertising agency networks in the world. It had won more Grand Prix awards in the 50-year history of the International Advertising Festival and Cannes than any other agency. He was once called by Advertising Age magazine the industry's soft-spoken visionary. And his agency has dealt with many large American corporate clients, Anheuser-Busch, Dell Computer, McDonald's, ExxonMobil, and many others. And since 2001, he has been really the force behind creating Business for Diplomatic Action, which he'll tell us a lot about. Next will be Helle, who is the Deputy Director of the Catherine and Shelby Cullom Davis Institute for International Studies and Director of the Douglas and Sarah Allison Center for Foreign Policy Studies, both at the Heritage Foundation, a very prominent think tank in Washington. She actually started her career in journalism and held a number of positions in the 1990s with the Washington Times, deputy editorial page editor, foreign affairs columnist, and in 1997 was named the newspaper's editorial page editor. She's traveled widely and still writes about foreign policy issues in many American media outlets and in other things. And at the Heritage Foundation has been doing a lot of work on a number of areas, but particularly on public diplomacy. David Litt, Ambassador Litt, now retired, served for 34 years as a career U.S. diplomat, specializing in the Middle East and Southwest Asia. In 2005-06, he was the third-ranking officer at the U.S. Embassy in Baghdad with the title of Political Military Counselor. He'd also served as U.S. Ambassador to the United Arab Emirates in 1995-98, as political advisor to CENTCOM and Special Operations Command at MacDill Air Force Base in Florida, and indeed was here at Duke a few years ago as our State Department diplomat in residence. He received numerous awards in his career, the Secretary of Defense Meritorious Civilian Service Award, the State Department Superior Honor Award, and probably the only blemish on his record is that he got his bachelor's at that school down the road that happened to win a certain title this year that still has a lot of us grousing about it. But I will say, as one of my colleagues here, who is from UNC, I congratulated him the day after. That demonstrated that maybe there can be peace in the Middle East too. In any event, we'll start with Keith, and we'll go down, and we'll have 3 presentations. I suspect that will really get us with a lot to talk about. Keith.
Thank you, Bruce, and thank you for inviting me. This has been a stimulating and exciting conference for me as one of the only non-lawyers in the room. I have understood some of it, but I've been inspired by all of it. I'm very pleased that you included the subject of public diplomacy in your conference about national security. The direct link between the two is not always obvious. But as Secretary of Defense Robert Gates says, quotes, "Our national security strategy depends upon securing the cooperation of other nations, which in turn will depend heavily on the extent to which our efforts abroad are viewed as legitimate by their publics." In the month before his inauguration, Barack Obama told his hometown newspaper, the Chicago Tribune, that he hoped to, quote, "reboot America's image around the world." He promised an unrelenting desire to create a relationship of mutual respect and partnership in countries who, in his words, want their citizens and ours to prosper together. The world, he said, is ready for that message. Indeed, the world has been waiting for a long time for such a message, and the President, it seems, is off to a good start. His announcement of the closing of Guantanamo, his timetable for withdrawing troops from Iraq, his promise to deliver a major speech from a Muslim capital, and his personal popularity are no doubt contributing factors to the slight improvement in America's reputation reported by the most recent BBC World Service poll released in February. But regardless of short-term indicators, the continuing problem of America's low standing in the minds of foreign publics is a threat to our national security, our economy, and our future. When, as of February this year, more than half of our friends in Canada, Australia, and Great Britain still say American influence in the world is mainly negative, in Germany the number is 72%, that being the case, we need to do something about our relations with the world. When large majorities of Egyptians, Pakistanis, Moroccans, and Indonesians still believe that our, quotes, war on terror is not about protecting America at all, but about military domination of the Middle East and dividing the Islamic religion and its people, well, then it's time to better engage the Muslim world. But negativity toward our foreign policy is not the only cause of anti-American sentiment over the recent past. There are other root causes the private sector can effectively address by shifting the international dialogue from foreign policy to civil society. In qualitative research we conducted in 17 countries during the months just after 9/11 and pre-Iraq, our questions to people on the streets about what they liked about America produced expressions of sympathy and a long list of positives. They liked our can-do spirit, our youthful enthusiasm, They appreciated our ethnic diversity, our wealth, our technology, our higher education, and some even mentioned our benevolence. But so soon after 9/11, the negative perceptions revealed by their answers to the question, "What don't you like about America?" were surprisingly strong and consistent across all regions of the globe. The number one negative perception at that time was that America exploits. A man from Chile put it this way: Americans come in and they attach themselves like a foreign body or a disease that infects the body, but they don't care about the body. They just take and move on. A second negative perception was that we corrupt by promoting values inconsistent with local standards, mores, even religion. In some countries, our entertainment product was a positive, but in others, a negative. A Muslim mother said, "I'm fine with my kids buying Levi's and Nike, but how do I protect them from Madonna and M&M?" And it stands to reason, of course, that the most sexually explicit and criminally violent part of our entertainment output is greatly helpful to those who wish to present us as a godless enemy. The third negative perception, also very strong, was that Americans themselves are arrogant, ignorant, and culturally clueless. We were also seen as loud, materialistic, and totally self-absorbed. This is the ugly American syndrome. When I asked the respondent from New Zealand how it is exactly that we Americans manifest our arrogance, he smiled and said, "You honestly believe that inside every human on the planet is an American trying to get out?" And he said, "It's not so. We love much of your culture. We like your people. But we have a Kiwi culture, and maybe you should learn something about that." On the matter of ignorance, a German woman asked, "How can you pretend to lead the world when you know nothing about the world?" And the validity of her question was borne out by a National Geographic survey revealing that 1/3 of Americans 18 to 34 couldn't locate the Pacific Ocean on a map. Arrogance, ignorance, cultural insensitivity, these are widely held negative perceptions about America that we reasoned could be either directly or indirectly tied to the global expansion of U.S. business. And if that were true, then why couldn't business be enlisted to help change those negatives to positives? That reasoning in 2002 led to the formation of Business for Diplomatic Action, a not-for-profit organization to enlist the U.S. business community in actions to improve the standing of America in the world, with the goal of once again seeing the United States admired as a global leader and respected as a courier of progress and prosperity to all people. Our tagline says, "Building bridges, new bridges to the world." Today, our board includes executives from PepsiCo, McDonald's, Microsoft, Time Warner, Google, American Airlines, Toyota, International Franchise Association, Sesame Street, and a number of global advertising, public relations, and media firms. In addition, we have an impressive list of senior advisors. As Bruce mentioned, both he and Helle are on that list of very distinguished people. The U.S. Chamber of Commerce has endorsed and commended our programs, and we expect to add at least 5 more companies to our board by year's end. Why should business care about public diplomacy? The most obvious reason is that business needs a free-flowing world economy, absent of obstacles and unfriendly regulations. And in most countries, government leaders who form and enforce policies that affect U.S. business are influenced by their constituencies, in other words, public opinion, which in the age of the internet is quickly, broadly, and often inaccurately formed. Therefore, negative public opinion of America is contrary to the self-interest of American business. For example, Business Week says the current anti-American backlash caused by the economic meltdown could make it more difficult for American companies to make acquisitions in Europe. U.S. business also needs a world that welcomes American brands. And while there are no hard data to prove that sales of U.S. brands are suffering overseas, it cannot be a good thing when 18% of the general population in G8 countries claim a negative change in their willingness to purchase American products. It can't be a good sign when Smart Car advertised in South Africa, a big billboard along the roadway, which said, German engineering, Swiss innovation, American nothing. It also seems likely that there is a positive relationship between favorable attitudes toward the United States in a given country and that country's citizens' travel to the United States. This has serious implications for America's fourth largest industry, leisure and hospitality, which employs more than 13 million Americans. The United States is losing share in the lucrative international travel market. According to the U.S. Travel Association, this share has amounted to lost spending by tourists of $137 billion. This is between 2000 and 2007, $137 billion. Lost tax revenues of $22 billion. Lost payroll of $37 billion. And the loss of 230,000 jobs. Not only is it in the self-interest of American business to change negative opinion to positive, business is uniquely qualified to lead the effort. The reach and resources of American multinationals is vast. Through their people and their brands, American business touches millions of lives throughout the world every day. The global workforce of the Coca-Cola Company alone, for example, is almost 10 times greater than that of the U.S. State Department. Business also knows how to get along across cultures and borders, especially those multinationals heavily dependent on foreign markets. They've learned to work cooperatively across cultural boundaries. What can business do? We have a 5-part strategy described by the acronym STARS. At least that's not the first acronym we've heard over the last 2 days. The STARS, the first S in our STARS strategy, we're trying to sensitize Americans to the need to be better global citizens through the media, through public appearances, and through our website at www.businessfordiplomatic.org. In this drive to make Americans more aware, we are also partnering with groups like the U.S. Center for Citizen Diplomacy, the National Council for International Visitors, and together with them, we are calling for a White House summit on citizen diplomacy, which would be the first of its kind since the Eisenhower era. Our second strategic path, the T in our STARS strategy, stands for transform. It could have stood for change, but then our acronym would have been SCARS, and I didn't think that was very good. To transform those American attitudes and behaviors that need to be changed. This strategy includes advocacy for friendlier visa policies and more hospitable entry procedures. In 2006, international travelers from 23 countries rated America's entry process as the world's worst by a 2-to-1 margin. At least 3 foreign papers we found last year ran sections urging travelers not to plan trips to America, citing the rudeness and the hassle they would be subjected to. Among 10 specific recommendations we made in a December meeting with the Obama transition team was that the new president should give a major speech at the Statue of Liberty, surrounded by foreign exchange students, scientists, artists, and business people, to reiterate globally that America welcomes well-intentioned visitors. We proposed then that he back up this sentiment by announcing visa reform and by insisting that U.S. Customs and Border Protection agents affect a friendly and welcoming attitude. We also need to transform our behavior as a people, turning Americans who make 60 million trips outside the United States every year into good citizen diplomats. That's 60 million opportunities to make a positive impression, multiplied by all the people each traveler meets. Apparently, we don't always make positive impressions. An Expedia survey of hoteliers last year ranked Americans as the most generous, but also the least stylish, the loudest, the least polite, and the least well-behaved. To aid in the transformation of traveling Americans into citizen diplomats, PepsiCo gave us a generous grant to create, produce, and distribute a 60-page little passport-sized World Citizens Guide, which Business for Diplomatic Action has now placed in the hands of U.S. young people who study abroad. The content is based on responses we got to a question we raised in nearly 100 countries. Please give us 10 suggestions for Americans traveling abroad. Some of them were not publishable. But by and large, the content was good and consistent. And it was turned into this little guide, which is rich in tips and information, has a mini disc for additional resources. This page says, you're not in Kansas anymore. It would be a good idea not to compare everything you find with the way it is back home, and so on. That was so successful that the U.S. Business Travel Association gave us a small grant to produce an abridged version for business executives titled How to Help Your Country While Traveling for Your Company, and it's been distributed by something like 800 companies so far. The 16 tips for American business executives are contained here. For example, speak lower and slower, and then there's one said, if you're going to talk with your hands, you better know what they're saying. I have brought a number of these. These you can buy online. These I brought a number, and they'll be in the back. Please help yourself to 2 or 3 of them. I think I have enough. To further help Americans become better citizen diplomats, we are launching a one-day workshop in global corporate diplomacy we've called Culture Span, developed in collaboration with the Thunderbird School for Global Management. This course, which we're marketing to businesses, is an intensive workshop for American business executives who make up about 10% of Americans traveling outside the United States. At the same time we're trying to change what needs changing, we need to amplify, that's the A in our STARS strategy, amplify those qualities about America that are still admired around the world. And so far, the very best way to do that is to bring more more visitors to our country. Beyond the positive impact on our economy, research proves conclusively that we are seen much more positively by people who have visited our country than by those who have not. One study shows that French citizens, for example, who have never visited the U.S., give us only a 17% favorability rating. French citizens who have visited, that number rises to 52%. And while the numbers vary, this kind of disparity is true across all countries. This is why BDA has lent talents and expertise to the U.S. Travel Association to rebrand America as a uniquely attractive destination. You can see the results at discoveramerica.com. And this is why we have joined with the travel industry to urge the government to fund promotion of travel to the United States. Ironically, I believe this is true, you may fact check me on this, the U.S. is the only developed country I know of with no Ministry of Tourism and no budget in the federal government for tourist promotion. Compare this to Australia, which was spending at the rate of $125 million annually to attract visitors to their country before the recent economic meltdown. I don't know what the number is now. Business is uniquely qualified to reach out, that's the R in our STARS strategy, to important foreign constituencies to build new bridges of understanding and respect. Our first such effort is concentrated in the Middle East, where we've joined with a group called Young Arab Leaders to form a business exchange fellowship that brings high potential young Arab executives to the United States for 3 weeks of business orientation and concurrently sends high potential young American executives to the Middle East. As a part of their business orientation, they of course learn much about each other's cultures. In this, the 3rd year of the program, we will bring 20 young Arab executives to the States and send 20 American executives to the Middle East. Still small in scope, but the program has proven transformative. In a gathering in Washington after last year's exchange, a young entrepreneur from the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia was asked by a moderator, well, Helmy, what do you think of the United States now that you've been here for the first time for 3 weeks? He looked right at me, startled me by saying, I speak for all of my Arab colleagues, we do not like America. And then quickly added, we love America. Similar transformative expressions from those who've gone from America overseas. And finally, the last S in our strategy is for serve. We serve as a private sector connection for public diplomacy efforts by the U.S. government. We've testified in Congress, created videos for U.S. embassies, served on an advisory committee of the State Department and Homeland Security, and we look forward to good relationships with the new administration in Washington. President Obama has said, quotes, "World opinion has turned against us, but we must neither retreat from the world nor try to bully it into submission." To turn rhetoric into reality, then, public diplomacy, we believe, must be re-emphasized and reorganized at the federal level, and we've made very specific recommendations in that regard, and I'm sure my colleagues have too. But resentment against the United States has been building for a long time, and it's to our advantage for our security, our economy, and our future to change those negative perceptions to positive. To steal a line from songwriter Johnny Mercer, we've got to accentuate the positive and eliminate the negative. And to do that, the enormous potential of America's private sector should be mobilized with American business leading the way. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks, Keith. And as Keith mentioned there, the booklet and I think also a handout with some recent data on it will be available in the back for people to pick up. Helle.
Yes, so first of all, thank you very much, Professor Jentleson, for inviting me to join the panel here. I want to say, as somebody who's been a little bit involved with and certainly observed the work of the Business for Diplomatic Action for a number of years, the group has taken some really remarkable initiatives and done so on a level that is doable, is not political, it is action-oriented, and their list of proposals and their studies are some of the very best that I think you'll find, even though there is competition from very big research institutions for the study of U.S. international public diplomacy. Business for Diplomatic Action knows the field on the ground and tends to come up with things that we can all engage in on a very concrete level. So I want to thank Keith Reinhard for his remarks and all his great work. A little closer. Okay, I'll do that. Yes. And then on to the ideas that we have been discussing at the Heritage Foundation, where I have been working for the past 7 years. In many cases, focusing on public diplomacy. I come out of a background in journalism and was actually not born in this country. I'm, I might say, an American by choice. I came here as a student from Denmark, and I've traveled widely back in Europe, and I often found that the perceptions of the United States in Europe and the realities that I live with every day were so remarkably different that it was a field that seemed to be a natural draw for me. The Obama administration, we are looking at the question here whether we can move from rhetoric to strategy in public diplomacy. And I want to say that I think President Obama's initial efforts at outreach, as those of Secretary of State Clinton, they don't always hit their target, but I think they get a high mark for effort. Many people have over the years advocated that the U.S. government needed to do a more high-level outreach, do a better job of listening, a better job of addressing the world, and that is exactly what they're trying to do at this point in time. But it doesn't always mean that the rhetoric does not outreach the facts on the ground, and that the symbolism may not overreach in some cases, and I want to call attention to some of those. The question of Guantanamo Bay. The president has been saluted for the executive order to close Guantanamo Bay within a year of his taking office. As we heard in the last panel, that is going to be more difficult than he probably conceived. In fact, it seemed, at least when you listened to the words of the administration, that not a whole lot of thought had been given to so far what to do with the very burning issues involved with the prisoners there. And the great outreach on Guantanamo Bay and many other issues actually at this point has only resulted, I believe, in one country, France, accepting one prisoner from the group that is currently being held there. So the question is, the outreach, the public sympathy that his election has generated, does that actually mean that foreign governments will then take action in consort with the Obama administration? There have also been a few glitches as far as the technicalities of the outreach. Secretary of State Clinton reached out to Russia. You can look at our Russia policy in any way you like, but whether the State Department or the National Security Council ought to have done more homework before she handed them a piece of Lego with a reset button saying what she thought was reset, and it turned out to mean something else. It's also, well, it was not the most elegant way to get off on that footing. And we know that in Central and Eastern Europe, our relations with Russia are being watched rather closely, and the president seems to have decided to reach out and embrace the Russian government in a way not seen since President Bush reached out to Vladimir Putin and gazed into his eyes and decided they could, he knew what was on his mind. We are currently, seems to be abandoning plans for a missile defense system in the Czech Republic and Poland based on negotiations with Russia on nuclear weapons, which have not really actually even gotten started. President Obama has set off on a great trip to Europe, and the reviews were wonderful in many cases in European papers. As Der Spiegel said, Obama has reduced America's sense of self-importance, which relates back to the issue of arrogance. It was very glitzy. It was warmly received in many publics, but how much substance was there behind it? You need to look at that as well as on the public diplomacy level. And in fact, if you do look at the European media, I want to urge you to make sure that you get both sides of the coin here. The British media, even the German and the French media, there was some notice of a lack of substance on the president's part. It was not simply a giant love fest, though I think Mr. Obama did a wonderful job of outreach. He needs to get over, for instance, the problem of the teleprompters, of the feeling that in some of those countries, at least, that there was more glitz than there was substance. That is something that the administration does need to address. And of course, the Arab world, we heard last night from the ambassador what a glowing reception the initial outreach by the Obama administration has received. And that is a good thing. There's no doubt that there are people we should reach out to in that part of the world. How much substance will that produce on a policy level? Yet again, judgment will have to be withheld, but I kind of have a sneaking suspicion that when it comes to government the policy level, we may not see the results materialize that the warm feelings that we're currently seeing should indicate. And this is not to be churlish, but to look at the facts on the ground and the rhetoric as two different things. And to go back to the issue of the panel here, will strategy match rhetoric? The rhetoric is there, will the strategy be there as well? The institutions of the US government, I believe, are ultimately what will help guarantee that the policy follow-through is there. And at the Heritage Foundation, we've been looking at those issues starting under the Bush administration, where a great many people felt that there was a gap, a real gap, a lack in understanding of the importance of public diplomacy. Unfortunately, it was at a time when we needed it more than ever. And it just did not seem to be a subject that the Bush administration, the National Security Council, the State Department was well qualified to deal with. Many of you will know that the part of the peace dividend of the 1990s was a U.S. information agency, which was disbanded in a bipartisan effort between the Clinton administration and the Jesse Helms Senate Foreign Relations Committee, a strange marriage of convenience that in 1999 brought the closure of the U.S. information agency. The Bush administration never managed to get a proper grasp on the subject, left it to the State Department largely and the Pentagon to handle public diplomacy efforts, and the State Department did not do very much. The Pentagon, by contrast, though, under Donald Rumsfeld, took the subject and ran with it, and did so in many cases quite successfully, because U.S. troops, committed as they are all over the world, in many cases, along with, in a different field than the business community, were on the ground level, were the most immediate ambassadors and most visible Americans around, certainly in Iraq and Afghanistan and in many other places of the world. Now it seems that the Obama administration's first actions are to try and pull some of the information apparatus, some of the muscle back from the Pentagon into the State Department. They have announced an increase in the State Department budget of 10% for a total of $51.7 billion in 2010. The State Department often complains about being underfunded, so that is probably a reasonably good sign if there is an improvement in the way that the money is being spent. It was reported in the news, in the paper yesterday as I was coming down here on the plane, that the office at the Pentagon that has overseen public diplomacy, the Office of Support for Public Diplomacy, which goes back several years to 2007, where it followed on another office, Office of Strategic Influence, that came to a sad end several years ago. That has been closed and or will be closed, and its assets moved into the State Department. So Hillary Clinton is clearly moving to try and put muscle into the State Department and USAID. But there are many problems there. In the last administration, almost 30% of the positions devoted to public diplomacy were not filled. The question is whether we'll be able to fill them now that there will be even more positions. And there is also a question of the U.S. international broadcasting, which is a large part of the public diplomacy apparatus. This is something that I've had a chance to study over the years as a journalist and as a member of the media community. And it's not clear here which way we'll be going. The Broadcasting Board of Governors, which currently oversees the operations of our international broadcasting systems, has not been a great success in the view of many of those of us who study the subject. It is a board composed of 9 members. It's a bipartisan board, and the Secretary of State is the 9th member on it. So whoever is in power can cast the last vote on that board. But it oversees the operations of Voice of America, Radio Free Europe, Radio of Liberty, and all the surrogate radios, Radio Sawa, El Hura, television, Radio Free China, you name it, we've got it all over the world. It is a very, very confusing mix of acronyms, which, if you talk of acronyms, this is a real basketful, which probably at some point needs somebody's attention to clean up. I would certainly hope that it's something that the Obama administration will want to tackle. Other countries around the world are moving aggressively on spreading their message around. China is investing more in international broadcasting, so is Russia, so is Britain, so is Germany. At the same time, the United States does spend a significant amount of money, $600 million a year, but does so in a very unfocused fashion. I have a quote here from Jeffrey Trimble, who is the Chief of Staff of the Broadcasting Board of Governors, who in last year in October remarked that it is not our mandate to influence. Well, if we're spending $600 million a year and the US government is not planning to influence anyone, you may well ask, what is it planning to do? And of course, we get to the problem here of how, as Richard Holbrooke has said, how can one man in a cave in Afghanistan, Osama bin Laden, out-communicate the entire communications apparatus of the US government? And there is that is the question that we need to answer. We have at the Heritage Foundation some proposals and papers that we would like you to consider. We have thought that there is a need for a reconstitution of something like a US information agency. Now, the world has changed since the Cold War, when the USIA led the fight in ideological information terms across the globe, particularly against Soviet information. But we need another coordinating body. Now, the Brookings Institution and Business for Diplomatic Action have proposed a non-governmental entity that could be a clearinghouse for ideas, programs, and on public diplomacy and outreach across the globe. And that has a lot of merit. It was absolutely something that that could be a step in the right direction. At the Heritage Foundation, we have, after discussing the subject with a great many actors in the government, concluded that it would be better to have an agency for strategic communication that could at least serve as a clearinghouse, as a place where the national strategy for public diplomacy and communication could be set. It would not necessarily need to be a huge agency, but it would one that would have a coordinating function and which be answerable to the National Security Council or even to the President because of the importance of what we're talking about here today. We also think that some of the assets of the Pentagon need to be considered. The combatant commands, such as Southcom, AFRICOM, CENTCOM, have some of the best clearinghouse practices in the government for the dissemination of information about the United States. The Pentagon is not the ideal point agency on messaging. I don't think you want the military structure to be in charge of that, but they are extremely efficient in what they do. So we do think that the combatant commands and the model in regional terms that they present is something that we need to look at. We need to look at the reform of the State Department itself, on the training of diplomats and the training of public diplomacy officers to broadcast the message abroad of the US government. The cones of the State Department are very segmented, and the tenure of the personnel on the ground is often just a few years, maybe 1 or 2 years actually in their postings, which means that people start developing a network and get their feet on the ground and start practicing public diplomacy, and then they move to another country. We need a system where people can spend more time in country and magnify and use the resources that they learn on the ground to manipulate and to work. Members of the media, you're cultural personalities, all these things. You need to, more information and more time to be effective. And then there's also, finally, most importantly perhaps, a message that we want to broadcast. What message do we want the world to receive about the United States? Keith very clearly outlined what people perceive about the United States, and I'm sure all of you recognize in some fashion the strengths and the weaknesses of this country as he was reciting the perceptions of other people abroad. I think actually you want to look at, actually the election of President Obama presents a wonderful opportunity to reinforce the message of the United States across the world. And you have to wonder whether people are not now able to look at this, or should look at, can look at this country in such a different light. That the election of this, one of the youngest presidents, African American, the first Western leader in this mold, elected by the United States, which has often been characterized as a society where racism is still alive. That in itself presents the American story in a very different light, and a story that I think ought to be a narrative that ought to be reinforced. And the message of, is there an American inside every foreigner that wants to get out? Well, in some ways, I do think there is, because not because of its America, but because of what the United States has stood for so many years, the concept of freedom, individual choice, and liberty. It doesn't mean that everybody has to sound and look like an American, but it means that they deserve the same choices and freedoms that Americans enjoy to do what they want with in their own cultures. And that is what has been so appealing for so many decades as the United States has engaged abroad. So I want to conclude with those thoughts. We are about to publish a major paper on the messaging of the content of messaging from the Heritage Foundation. It's authored by former Voice of America director Robert Riley, which I encourage you to look for in the coming months, which will emphasize those points. I just again want to say thank you for a chance to participate in the discussion here.
Thanks very much. And now, Ambassador Litt.
Thanks, Bruce. Don't know I have much more else to say. I would like to say, however, for those of you who might not know, the University of North Carolina fully endorses Ambassador Hasuna's recommendation and formal proposal last night that the Duke basketball team be sent off to the Middle East for a couple of years as sports ambassadors. What I will do is to look at these issues surrounding public diplomacy from the perspective of a practitioner of diplomacy. And I hope to make some recommendations that we can talk about to move beyond rhetoric into the implementation of a public diplomacy strategy. I will examine three things. First, what is public diplomacy from our point of view, and why is it important? Secondly, what went wrong with American public diplomacy? And thirdly, how can we resurrect the public diplomacy tools, some of which Helle talked about, for effective implementation of that public diplomacy strategy? So, to try to do this in 20 minutes, let's get to the first point, which is, what is public diplomacy, and after all, why is it so important? Public diplomacy is an instrument of national power. If we don't remember anything else today, please keep that in your minds. As we have heard several times, America's influence and its success around the world is as much about public perceptions as it is about the immediate impact of our policies, or the money we may have spent somewhere, or the services we may have rendered to some country, because most citizens around the world are just not touched directly by American government operations. But most citizens around the world can and do form opinions and judgments about America and about the United States government. So public diplomacy in our nomenclature, according to the literature that you will find pretty much widespread, is all about understanding, informing, engaging, and that influencing word, influencing global audiences beyond foreign governments to promote greater appreciation and understanding of U.S. society, culture, institutions, values, and policies. As you might understand by now, public diplomacy is a human resource intensive activity. It requires personal contact and two-way communications. These are key to the effective engagement of public diplomacy. The fact of the matter is, if we do not define ourselves, for sure our adversaries will define us for the rest of the world. And therefore, if we are not present, either in reality or even virtually, engaging directly with global audiences, we cannot effectively define ourselves. And this, I would argue, is the impact and the importance of what we've heard about President Obama's initial engagements around the world, as Ambassador Hassouna referred to last night, the importance of his interview with Al Arabiya as the first interview he gave to the Muslim world, the town hall meetings in Europe with European students, and so on. Listening to others and letting them know that we understand them is not just critical to personal relationships and effective personal relationships and the process of negotiation, as you all may, especially you lawyers, but it is also important in public diplomacy. But public diplomacy is much more than just understanding. It is about influencing, and it is about changing attitudes. So therefore, public diplomacy is much more than just messaging, clever speeches, and talking heads. After all, as we have heard before, if our policies are harmful and counterproductive, no message will make a silk purse out of that one. So in addition to the negative perceptions that Keith related to us, American policy has suffered quite a bit from the tensions, for example, between supporting undemocratic regimes in the name of regional stability, which sometimes is important, and promoting changes in those regimes in conformity with universally recognized norms, which is also important. And walking that tightrope has been extremely difficult. But without effective public diplomacy, the most cleverly conceived balancing act is going to be useless in the eyes of those disaffected populations. Glenn had mentioned before, in the panel before, about the delicate balancing act we have with respect to Guantanamo. The fact of the matter is that the United States must make every effort to be truthful, credible, and persuasive. And these are actually the words of Edward R. Murrow, one of the early directors of American public diplomacy. To be persuasive, he said, we must be believable. To be believable, we must be credible. Credible, we must be truthful. Allowing the United States to appear to global audiences as credible, truthful, and persuasive, we have to engage those audiences directly and effectively. So public diplomacy involves planning and implementing public diplomacy strategies through effective programmatic vehicles. And we used to have some of those once upon a time. Well, what went wrong with American public diplomacy? The first is structural and institutional. As Helle told us, we did have the U.S. Information Agency and its Foreign Service arm called the U.S. Information Service. It was created in 1953 under President Eisenhower, and it was an instrument of Cold War politics to disseminate information about the United States through broadcasts and press and libraries and academic and cultural exchanges. In fact, the second USIA director, Arthur Larson, resigned in some controversy, but he came here to be the chair of law at Duke University. The U.S. Information Agency very jealously guarded its independence, and its relations with state and Congress over the years, not just in the late 90s, were not always harmonious. When I joined the Foreign Service in the mid-70s, the U.S. Information Service was in its heyday. We had more public diplomacy officers then than we do today, and USIS programs were vibrant and widespread. Just to pick a few examples from my assignments, all of which had active and successful programs in those early years. At the U.S. Embassy in Kabul, we had in the late 1970s and throughout the 70s, we had a very active American Cultural Center with a library, with an auditorium, all sorts of presentations and performances, cultural and information programs, Fulbright and exchange programs were widespread. In Damascus, the American Cultural Center taught English as a foreign language. There was a library, there were Fulbright scholars and other scholars who came through speaker programs. And we had an important cultural center in Niamey, in Niger. I'll talk a little bit about Niger in a second. But then in 1999, finally, after some heavy tussling, Congress finally forced the consolidation of USIA into the State Department. That agency had acquired many enemies in Congress, including right here in North Carolina. But the second reason for the implosion of American public diplomacy was the debate over USIA's role as you as a government agency. Some had criticized USIA for having their programs, but their programs were completely untethered to any U.S. policy goals, and this sense of, well, we don't influence was very typical of some of the attitudes of some of the previous senior representatives of USIA. In fact, the USIA headquarters here, or in Washington, wielded very strong control over its USIS officers out in the field, their programs, their budgets, and so on. And as I said before, they really valued that independence that USIA had, especially in its information programs. But also, within the State Department and other parts of government, public diplomacy officers in USIS were seen as second-class citizens. They were not the front line of diplomacy. I dare say that's probably still the case today, much to my regret. Most embassies paid little attention, frankly, to USIS programs as having some intrinsic value to the mission's specific goals. And only a visionary embassy leadership that deliberately integrated USIS programs into the overall public diplomacy and broader policy efforts would really achieve those results from USIS offices and programs. This was our experience in Niamey, Niger. Just to spend 1 minute on that, in 1990, the Nigerian government, a military dictatorship, came to us and other donors and representatives saying, we would like to transform our country into a representative democracy. Can you help? Boy, can we ever. And we did. But the funny thing was, certainly at the beginning, the U.S. Information Service acted as if it were still some independent operation on autopilot, running its traditional programs of inviting teachers with no connection to a new democratization program. And it was not until the ambassador pulled all of the resources to her disposal to include USIS programs that we really got a very effective U.S. mission policy in Niger. Well, today, the program has swung the pendulum has swung the other way in the disaggregation of public diplomacy vehicles, programs, and officers sprinkled throughout the State Department with minimal, frankly, programmatic input into what the State Department does. My experience in Kabul and also in Afghanistan were that in these days, the ambassadors and the deputy chiefs of mission rule the roost with respect to their public affairs officers that are frankly poorly staffed and under-resourced, no longer coming back from State Department with resources and programs. Even wanting to, ambassadors could not generate resources for necessary public diplomacy programs. For example, Ambassador Khalilzad in Afghanistan tried to institute English language training officer programs into Kabul and failed because the State Department just couldn't find the resources or the people to fill that requirement while he was ambassador there. It was not until after the brilliant and beautiful wife of a Foreign Service officer volunteered to do that job after Ambassador Khalilzad had left that we finally got a person out to Kabul and State scrambled to find a few resources, not very much, to engage in English language training program within Afghanistan. Unfortunately, it ended after she departed. She's sitting in the front row, but I won't embarrass her too. And finally, the final reason for the fecklessness of American public diplomacy has been the growing concern for the security of American public buildings, personnel, and property overseas, as we can imagine, especially after 2001. Embassies grew from having guards and gates to having long physical setbacks from the streets, and then massive walls and mechanical barriers and infrastructure, thick plastic shields, and so on and so forth. Cultural and commercial centers, once located in very convenient, very well-trafficked areas of cities, in some cases withdrew into those barriers and walls. Contact with the public became increasingly virtual, electronic, remote, and frankly just two-dimensional. And at the same time, as Keith very rightly pointed out, our visa policies shrank dramatically the number of persons allowed in the United States, and the procedures to get a visa became so cumbersome and at times so embarrassing when we invite a well and favorably known person to attend a U.S. Funded program, but their visa becomes delayed inordinately, or worse, more embarrassingly, denied because of a name similarity or some other technicality. We are the people who have egg on our face. And equally atrocious, as Keith pointed out, is the treatment of some people at our borders, especially those visitors who are invited guests of the United States government. The stories of their treatment are legion. Probably some of those stories are apocryphal, who knows. But the fact is that people do hear about this, and some of those invited officials just turn around and go home. They say, we don't need this. And I endorse fully, as do many other people, Keith's proposals on visa reform. This needs fixing. This is not your father's public diplomacy. So how do we resurrect public diplomacy tools for effective implementation? I would draw your attention to two of the studies I think that Bruce was alluding to, with which I happen to agree 100%, and I'll talk about some of their recommendations. One is a 2003 study by former Ambassador Ed Jerigian, who was our ambassador in Syria in the late 80s. He's now the director of the Baker Institute at Rice University, entitled Changing Minds, Winning Peace, a New Strategic Direction for U.S. Public Diplomacy in the Arab and Muslim World, but the principles contained therein apply globally, and they are just as accurate today as they were 6 years ago. The second is a study published last year by the American Academy of Diplomacy and the Stimson Center, entitled A Foreign Affairs Budget for the Future, Fixing the Crisis in Diplomatic Readiness, and they address a number of the issues that Helle rightly raised. Among the critical needs for fixing a few dozen more American cultural centers or similar facilities around the world, which will require a reassessment of our management of risk tolerance. We are not at all a risk-tolerant government. In fact, we are a risk avoidance, a risk elimination government. We have to take a look at that. We could also expand what we call American corners, which are partnerships with host nation organizations which give information on U.S. Society, U.S. culture, politics, how you get a visa, how you become a student, open to everyone, and they're usually set up in libraries and universities around the country. Increasingly significant is English language training, as I alluded to before, especially in countries like Afghanistan. Expanding our academic and other exchanges, including the International Visitor Program. How many of you are aware that dozens of international visitors come to North Carolina through the State Department's program every year? Mike, I figured you would. They come from all over the world looking to engage with their counterparts here in North Carolina to meet with business people or Americans in general, including to be hosted at homes. The International Affairs Council that's based in Raleigh coordinates these visits, and in the past month, that council expected to receive a delegation of young prosecutors and criminal investigators from Bulgaria, a delegation of moderate Iraqi clerics and government officials, and a delegation from Afghanistan concerning women as business and economic leaders. If you would like to know more about this program, I suggest you check with the International Affairs Council. I can give you more about that. Engaging business and the private sector. Keith went through how we can do that more effectively. I would add that the private sector can help in devising our broadcasting strategies, including the messaging that we have, programming of messages around the world, and applying appropriate technologies to appropriate parts of the world. For example, the radio in Africa, the television in the Middle East, internet in Europe and Eurasia, and perhaps mixes of those in various other parts of the world. U.S. universities can and should play a major role in expanding American public diplomacy. And in the interest of time, I won't go into any detail. We could talk about support for NGOs, think tanks, and so on overseas. Those are all part of it. In short, public diplomacy is essential to our national security, the point we started off with. It matters what we do as a nation and how we behave overseas. And we must shape proactively the public's perception of that behavior and why we do what we do. If we don't shape those perceptions, someone else will, and public diplomacy, I would argue, is the vehicle for us to do that. It must be deliberative, and it must be an input into the formulation and the implementation of policy, not as an afterthought or as a reaction, as frankly it is done today. Public diplomacy is not expensive, but it does require staffing, training, and program resources, and most of all, leadership, which I believe we do have today.
Thanks very much. It's been an excellent panel, and I want to thank you all very much. Let me just make a couple comments, reinforce and maybe just add a couple things, and we'll open it up to the floor. One, I think, is, as I look at these issues, and we look at, our experiences in the past, during the Cold War and the like, it's very important that we learn from, but not over-glorify the past. I think the experience of Voice of America and other U.S. Public diplomacy key institutions and strategies in the European context, in the Eastern European context, in the anti-Soviet context, was enormously successful. Now, as has been said, you can't just do the same thing today. It's a very media age, but there are some lessons to learn. At the same time, I would argue that in the developing world, in the third world, we were much less successful in the Cold War. We tend to look back at the Cold War and say, we won, they lost, great. But if you look around, the president is at the Summit of the Americas today. And some of the resentments he's encountering there in Latin America are not just sort of the, fans of Hugo Chavez, but indeed they go way back in American history in terms of our relationship with Latin America. Some of our issues in the Middle East go back long before Al-Qaeda and the like. And I think that we have had more of a problem in terms of our relations with the developing world, with the third world, as we used to call it, than we had in Europe and including the Eastern European context. And so I think as we look to the past, we need to see where there were some mistakes made as well as some successes and try to learn from both as we try to deal broadly with the world. Secondly, I think it's important, and a lot of the comments were along these lines, we understand that we live in a global age. And the best way I try to express this is through an astronomy metaphor that goes back to my days as a young undergraduate at Cornell when I had a then unknown astronomy professor that used to teach astronomy for non-majors by the name of Carl Sagan, who the world then got to know. We have a tendency to see the world like the old Greek philosopher and astronomer Ptolemy saw the universe. The Earth was at the center and everything revolved around the Earth. That may well be the way the world was in a previous era, in the Cold War, where we were sort of the wielder of power, the economic engine driving the world, the bastion of free world ideology. But indeed, the world in which we live in today is much more like the world that Copernicus corrected Ptolemy on, in which there are a lot of different countries that have their own orbits. When you talk to people around the world, and this notion that not everybody wants to be like Mike or have an American, sort of jump out from them, there's a lot of pride and identity out there in negative ways and in positive ways about cultures, about ways of handling the balance between individual rights and community, we're now in a debate about, the old debate about, capitalism was better than socialism. Well, that was 20th century, that's over. But we're in a debate right now about which forms of capitalism are best in the world, how much regulation and the like. And I think that this Copernican world is one in which, the real question, it's another cold subject, is what's going to be at the center holding us all together like the sun. But it's not revolving around the United States. We remain the single most powerful country, and if you will, the one with the most gravitational pull. But we have to really adapt to what it means to be part of a global age. And we need to be more global, I think. And so part of this public diplomacy is really a two-way street, not only helping people understand what makes us proud to be Americans, but learning from others as well along those lines. That it's a global age, and it's not even one that's multipolar or anypolar, but it has a very different dynamic than before. The Obama opportunity that a lot of us have talked about. And I think part of it is not just, is his persona. He has a global persona. This is someone whose father was from Kenya, who lived in Indonesia. And part of what I found in my travels around the world is what Helle said is right, the notion that America would never elect an African American, and finding out that that wasn't true, did enormous value for our sense of us as a model. But I think it's also, consistent with this notion of a global age, is that this is a persona, and the way he's been communicating with audiences, his use of the word mutual respect in many of his communications with the Middle East, a very important word there, is this persona. And we have to, take advantage of that. The delegation that David mentioned of Afghan legislators, women business leaders. I was actually changing planes in Dallas when they were boarding to come to Raleigh 2 weeks ago. And the person running the group ran around and talked to the other people waiting to board and said, I don't want you to be afraid. I know they all have head covers, but we've brought them to the United States, and this is who they are. And the fact that she felt it necessary to say that to the people in the waiting room for the flight, I think, was instructive. It's an enormous opportunity. A lot of the issues do relate to policy. Some are policies that we will probably change. Some of them are policies we probably will not change. And there will be some anti-Americanism that goes with that. That kind of comes with the territory. I was in Syria and Saudi Arabia in early January as a delegation from 2 U.S. think tanks. And we had a range of experiences, including actually a very long and interesting meeting with President Assad of Syria about some substantive issues. But also, I was driving around with a Syrian social worker who worked with Catholic Relief Services, working with Iraqi refugees that were in Syria. And we spent most of the day together, and at one point I said to her, so what do you think of, it was still the transition of our president-elect? And she said, I'm very excited, but I'm trying to control my expectations. And so there can be a problem also of unrealistic expectations. I think this is one of the things that Helle was addressing that have to be managed as well. Expectations are a good thing, hope is a good thing, but they have to be managed. And lastly, the point I just want to throw in, and David hit on this, is our role as universities in all of this. As I think about our students, I often talk to them about the need to be a global generation for any number of reasons. True, a whole lot of people out there speak English, but we probably have the lowest percentage of people in the world that speak a second language, not to mention third languages. And the ways in which I think we still need to understand that we are not, it is not a Ptolemaic world, not everything revolves around American culture. Some of that is study abroad, but do study abroad and not just hang out with the other Americans. And some of that is in any career that people go into. If you're a banker and you can speak Chinese or Russian, it'll probably help you advance your career, as well as open up opportunities for you when you're not working to travel and have experiences in which you can engage with the rest of the world. And frankly, for us as a nation, whether it's our economic competitiveness or our capacity to understand how to do diplomacy or a whole variety of other things, this generation really needs to be a global generation, and we as a university have an important role to play in all that in a whole variety of ways, whether it's not just sending students abroad, but bringing more students to our own campuses, and just the perspective that we take about what it means to be global and not strict, have pride in America, but not strictly American-centric. So anyway, why don't we open it up for comments and questions? There are 1, 2 mics on both sides of the room. Why don't we start over here with this gentleman?
This was a very informative panel, and I appreciate all of the participants. Raised a lot of questions in my mind, but I'll confine those to just 2. The first one is the concerns the Middle East. As long as the United States is perceived by the Arab world as always coming down on the side of Israel, how will we be effective in the Middle East? As Thomas Friedman said at one time at least, the road to peace runs through Jerusalem. And it seems to me that will remain a problem unless we can change the perception of the Arab world. My second question is very specific to Mr. Reinhard. I'm impressed by what the business community is doing, but are you doing anything at the cradle of the institutions which create our business executives of the future? I'm thinking of the business schools, like this one we're meeting in right now, the MBA. Are you doing anything in the MBA programs around the country?
Keith, why don't we start with the second one and then?
Okay. We have initiated relationships with a number of the business schools, but we have a formal relationship forming with Stern Business School at NYU, who's providing interns for us to help us with our work. We've had discussions with, certainly with Wharton. We have advisors from these schools on our advisory staff, but we haven't taken it further than that. However, I believe that the exchange with the young Arab leaders that I mentioned, business exchange, needs to be scaled. We're not going to change the world by bringing 12 or 20 or 30 or even 60 young Arabs to the United States and sending our people over there. We need institutions that can help us scale that to the Fulbright level. And I think some of the business schools have expressed interest in working with us on that. My own answer to the Tom Friedman comment, I'm not qualified, I'm not a diplomat, I'm a business person, and our feeling is that while wiser people are answering that question, we will shift the dialogue from foreign policy to civil society and build strong bridges through other channels while other people are figuring out what to do about Israeli-Arab conflict.
Yeah, it's an important question, something that I, as a diplomat in the Middle East, wrestled with for a long time. And what I've learned is something that Ambassador Hassouna addressed perfectly last night, I thought. And that is, for most Arabs, most Muslims in general, but certainly most Arabs, the issue is not American support for Israel. That they understand. The issue is America's sense of fairness, application of concepts of justice equally, and how the United States appears to be a fair broker in helping these groups to come together and to make peace, which has been extremely difficult. In fact, I would argue that the Arabs are as much a promoter of America's ties with Israel as anybody else, because they know we are perhaps the only ones who can make an impact on Israel's government. But there are even more issues than just our support for Israel. It has to do with perceptions of our support for undemocratic regimes, which some people come up with, so that a common solution in all of this is for the United States to devote its attention, energy, and resources to helping build the proper institutions, some things that actually Keith also referred to, civil society, institutions upon which we can rely on the Palestinian Authority, for example, to be the interlocutor for the Israelis, and a set of other activities that we can engage in so that we are in fact seen as a power that not only supports Israel and tries to persuade Israel of XYZ issue, but also who helps the Arab people, and in particular the Palestinians, to develop themselves up to be an equal partner and a good partner for the Israelis. So there's a lot of work to do, and it's not just that we are seen as a supporter of Israel.
I would just also add as a word of caution that the role of the United States, yes, it is extremely important, and it has an important leadership role in the region. However, you've got to look at the facts on the ground on the two sides, whether they are in fact conducive to an agreement amongst themselves. On the Israeli side, you now have a conservative government which is not terribly likely to want to make many compromises on the security side, and you have divisions among the Palestinians themselves that make it extremely difficult for anyone, no matter their intentions or their power, to force an agreement between the two sides. So bringing it all back to the United States, even under new leadership, even in a new day, whatever you look at, however you look at it, might raise expectations which will not, in the end, be fruitful. There is a concern, I think, I certainly have it, that there are unrealistic expectations at the moment in the Arab world from the American side. But I will see, got to keep an open mind.
Yeah, I would just add, if you take a perspective on this over the last 30 or 40 years, going back to the Nixon-Kissinger period, through the Carter, Camp David, Reagan administration, President Bush, George H.W., and President Clinton, I think that the United States, there were particular issues we had disagreements on with the Israelis, the Arabs, but we fundamentally maintained an unequivocal commitment to the security and survival of the State of Israel, with a role in relations with the Arab world that allowed us to play the role in the peace process that didn't solve it but moved it forward. And I think that the Obama administration, there's been a disjuncture, frankly, I think, in that in the last 8 years, and the Obama administration is trying to find a version of that that fits the current reality. So a lot of the engagement strategies that are directed at the Arab world are trying to establish, there are many issues that we have, obviously with Iran, with Syria, that relate to other things other than Israel and our bilateral relations, and trying to reestablish and make some progress on those, along with the very difficult issues that confront us on the Arab-Israeli peace process.
I'm Larry Weinstein. I moderate a class here at Duke on what's going on in the world today for seniors. My question's on use of technology. We have really moved into a new age that's called variously Web 2.0 or the new era or new media or whatever you'd like to call it. And I know, Mr. Reinhard, your businesses have spent a lot of time on how to use Facebook and MySpace and whatever to get their message across. Are there similar efforts going on in the public policy arena, in the government or wherever?
May I comment on that? Thank you for that question and that point. One of the reasons that we, and as Helle mentioned, we have with Brookings proposed a separate quasi-governmental entity outside of the government, outside of Washington, which would have several very specific responsibilities, one of which would be to employ the new media in a way that the federal government really can't do. Our discussions about the new media and the internet with State Department have used the words control. Who will control? As you know, that word does not exist in the internet. And so we think an entity outside the government could utilize social networks, Facebook, MySpace, Space, and all the rest. One idea we have as Business for Diplomatic Action, which has generated some interest but no funding yet, is called United States of Mind, a sort of a digital Peace Corps. And people could aggregate themselves around an issue and geography with other people concerned about that issue and geography, and then be presented with an array of service opportunities ranging from sort of a Kiva-like contribution or microfinance, all the way to service in-place opportunities, and we would connect the visitor with appropriate NGOs and companies on the ground in that particular area of interest. So the the enemy, if you will, is using the internet better than we are. And I've seen some of the content that they're providing. It is awesome in terms of its professional quality, some of the videos that they're putting on the internet. And one of our ambassadors to one of the Middle East countries said the State Department was putting out a magazine called High, which they thankfully withdrew. She said, meanwhile, kids in her country were getting Al-Qaeda messages on their cell phones. So we really have to advance that. And we think we have some ideas to do it, but we haven't found the right organizations or the right funding.
I don't know what the State Department's problems with control or other issues are. I grew up in the era of carbon paper. So, but what I do know is that if you go, that the American Embassy in Damascus is in Facebook. So that the Syrian government's effort to close down the American Cultural Center, which it did for political reasons last year, okay, we understand that. They did not close down contact of people over the internet with the embassy's website and so on. I also know that the State Department sends out blogs in a variety of languages. It is a new generation. When I was diplomat in residence here, I argued to students, we are looking for not just political science majors and international affairs majors, but majors in communications, cultural issues, technology, a wide business administration, a wide variety of new disciplines that will enhance our ability to communicate.
I think the question to answer is that the U.S. government, even with the efforts that Ambassador Litt describes, it lags way behind the private sector on this. I mean, they've just now appointed an advisor on new technologies in the State Department, and their own computer systems are archaic. I mean, trying to move this is a gigantic effort, so that's why other organizations might be much better suited to spearhead that information technology aspect of public diplomacy. I mean, and if, as Keith Reinhard mentioned, if you look at what Al-Qaeda is doing, I mean, it is phenomenal. The way they do recruiting, snuff videos. The Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty did a study of particularly the terrorist uses of the internet last year, which just blows you away.
One segment I saw, which was shown to me in Washington, they had taken images from Abu Ghraib and mashed them together with images that they got from a Hungarian porn site. And the soundtrack was musical and poetic, which, in the Muslim community, poetry is very important. And so it was about a 3-minute segment. The production quality was awesome. Everything about the way the thing was put together was very professional. And this is the kind of stuff that we're up against.
Up there?
Hi, Nathan Sales from George Mason Law School. I was hoping the panelists could talk a little bit about the various sources of anti-Americanism and try to weigh them as best you can. So, for instance, how much of contemporary anti-Americanism around the world is the result of specific policies of the Bush administration, Iraq, Guantanamo Bay? How much is the result of long-standing features of American foreign policy that are not dependent upon any particular administration? For instance, support for Israel, engagement with Middle Eastern governments that are not what you would describe as democratic. And how much of the anti-American attitudes around the world are simply a naturally occurring result of the international geopolitical order, sort of a structural problem? The most powerful nation in the world is always going to be on the receiving end of derision. Thank you.
I'll take a shot at that and pass it on. There actually was a very good book on this done a couple years ago by Bob Cohane, who used to be on the faculty here, and Peter Katzenstein of Cornell, where they really tried to break it down, and they sort of came up with a typology. My thinking is there are a couple of categories. And with your last point, so I grew up in New York in the glory days of the New York Yankees. and got used to the notion that you could be resented for being number one, okay? Yeah, right, I know. That's, so there is something that comes with that, okay? That's your geopolitical order. But I think that actually accounts for a relatively small percentage of it. And you can call that the uncontrollable, the part that you live with, right? Then I think there are, policies that, in my view, were recent, and that may change in this administration. But then there are other policies that probably won't change. The discussion about Israel, to the extent that some of the anti-Americanism will not change till the United States stops supporting Israel's, survival and security. That's not going to happen. The part that comes with the points that Ambassador Litt was emphasizing about, a sense of fairness and justice, that will change. My point about Latin America is some of these resentments go back much further. So the goal, I think, of public diplomacy is to work with those parts that you can. There's a whole lot, I don't know, call it 60% there that I think is what a lot of these proposals are addressed at, if not. And so even when you break it down analytically, there's still a whole lot that you can work with. That doesn't mean abandoning things that are core national interests.
Yeah, go ahead.
No, I was going to say, I think you're absolutely right that there is a mixture of causes, some of which we can address and some of which we probably cannot do much to change. I want to just add one that was mentioned earlier, the American entertainment industry, which is one of the most thriving American exports, most successful exports, unfortunately not always to the benefit of America's image in the world, since it tends to cater, and I don't know how to put it, but the lowest common denominator in some ways is what you're looking at. And as a mother of American children, I would certainly express exactly the same problems with the contents of much American mass entertainment as the Muslim woman who was cited earlier. So there needs to be some introspection here in some areas, and I just want to throw the American entertainment industry into the mix as one of the causes. There is so much more to this society that we ought to showcase to the world.
I wanted to say it's a very complex question, but I would also look at it from the point of view of how do the people who form judgments about the United States, anti-American judgments, get their information. Some of it is through their schools. And for example, in the United Arab Emirates, a number of very progressive thinking, forthright Emirati young citizens have, I think, very balanced views of the United States. That's not what they got in their school systems. A second thing is exactly what Keith was talking about. People listen to or watch the internet and they get their opinions from that, or from satellite television stations. So those are formulated by messages they get. This is what we are up here to discuss, and that is, how does the United States get into that game? How does it help to shape proper perceptions of what the American film industry is all about? It is not about it's not all about what some people purport it to be, and we need to give some balance to that.
It's a very good question, and I agree with my colleagues that we haven't been able to quantify it. I will say that the work that we've done and the history that we've looked at suggests that while there has always been anti-American sentiment since the founding of our country of some kind, there was an inflection point after the Cold War when people such as Francis Fukuyama felt that the history had ended and so forth. We emerged as the lone superpower, and that led to the penalty of leadership, as you've discussed. An old Cadillac ad had that headline, penalty of leadership. When you're the top guy, you're going to get shot at. That's part of it. Other people have suggested that we are a convenient scapegoat. If they are not doing well with their own government, why not blame the United States? But it seemed to be exacerbated by the US-led global expansion of business. That seemed to be another inflection point where the US-led global expansion created impressions that globalization might be good for the United States, but is not good for me. And then all of these other, disagreement with our stance on Kyoto, the International Court, our death penalty, all these things were sort of latent. And had we done our research post-Iraq, I wouldn't have started Business for Diplomatic Action, because in February 2002, foreign policy was not among the negative root causes. When Iraq happened, then all these latent things seemed to be ignited. And now foreign policy, disagreement with foreign policy, is the chief root cause. And we can't do anything about that as a business community. We can start, as I said, to shift at least part of the debate and dialogue into civil society, things we can do. Now, having said that, American business has a problem of its own right now, created by some of the actions here, and trust in American business has plummeted, and so that's another job we have to work on.
I think what I'd like to do now is gather up any remaining questions, and then we'll just go around and answer them collectively. So we'll start up there, yeah. We'll start up there, then we'll come here, yeah.
Is it on?
I understand.
And thank you very much. I want to make another perspective available to you, because it appears to me that all the approaches, all the strategies that you have deliberated here do not incorporate anything about an African perspective. Lamentably, I would say, even at a very high level of the US government, not a lot of attention has been paid to Africa as a very important geopolitical now counterpoise to the Middle East. Apart from whatever military strategies have been adopted, like AFRICOM, I think the US needs something more than that to use Africa, considering its geographical contiguity to the Middle East. There are a lot of things that could be done, a lot of strategies that could be evolved to use Africa to neutralize, if I may use the word neutralize, the hostility that we're talking about here, emanating from the Middle East. Unfortunately, as an academic community like this, I expected that mention to be made of Africa, but I have not heard much about it. Secondly, and this is my last point, for us in Africa too, it is something like a dilemma. We can't understand the drive for American national security and its values that tend to be in conflict. Why are you concerned about whatever treatment is given to terrorists in Guantanamo Bay? We don't understand. And you're talking about human rights to people, about people who don't even want to be human. Yet, you want to treat them very, how do you call it, democratically and all that. I can tell you, somewhere along the line, this is why American type democracy does not succeed in Africa. Because probably your own perception of your values of democracy, freedom, liberty are totally at variance with our own understanding of them. So I thought that I should just chip this in this conference, that you should try and from an academic point of view, because I know that in the United States, the academia plays a very important part in the formulation of national policies. I think that you should also try to look at the African perspective, which could be evolved in probably another conference or something, how you can use the Africans, and not from a military point of view, but from a geopolitical and strategic point of view, to counter the Middle East. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you. We'll address that as we go along. Judge Everett? Yeah.
Very quick question. What do you think about public diplomacy closer to home with respect to Cuba, Mexico, and Venezuela?
Okay, we'll take that one as well. Over here.
Oh, I just had a question, and actually our last questioner brought it up to some extent. We obviously want to communicate our core values, such as individual rights, human rights, democracy to other countries. But the question I had was, how do we do that to cultures that do not have that ingrained in their psyches, such as China, which does not have a history or culture of human rights as we know it, or of individual rights, and as the last questioner said, like much of Africa. So how do we communicate our message without getting into the ugly American syndrome and arrogance of which we've been accused in the past?
Okay. So why don't we start and answer whichever, we'll get them all answered as we go. We have one more? Okay.
Thank you very much. I just want to make a comment to the good doctor here. Was about 2 years ago, I heard James Jones, who's currently our national security advisor, speaking at an event at Johns Hopkins, and that was one of the very points that he had made, was that America lacked a long-term, coherent strategy with regards to Africa. And unfortunately, in our past, in the way we dealt with the Cold War and proxy state wars, we always had a very short-term view towards Africa. We will assist this country because it is in a bipolar conflict or has a civil war, and we need to support X side against our bipolar opponent. So the example that China is showing a long-term view with regards to economic activity in Africa. It is definitely towards the Chinese economic advantage to have this relationship, but if it's a long-term view where it is viewed as mutually beneficial on both the part of the Africans as well as the part of the Chinese, it can be a model that's much more sustainable than a short-term, we're here, we'll take what we want, and then we'll leave when we no longer require your services or your raw materials. Thank you.
Thank you. Keith, you want to start us, and we'll just come down the table here?
Well, I agree. I mean, as a citizen and non-professional, I agree with everything that's been said about Africa. The last point, how do we communicate, how do we get our message to people who don't share our DNA, really, is a very interesting question, because even in the testimonies in Congress, I found it troubling that our leaders, at least in those sessions, were constantly talking about how do we tell people about our values. My understanding, because my whole career is in marketing, is the first act is to listen very carefully. Listening in itself is an act of diplomacy. And when we listen carefully, we might find that our idea of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness can be extended, but their definition of happiness might vary from ours. And we have to respect those differences. And so I think that the first answer to your question is not to tell, not to impose, not to assume that what we've figured out for us is automatically best for everybody else. Because we know that the problems that confront the planet are going to require the cooperation of all nations, and that has been said eloquently many times here. And so we have to learn to work with each other, agree on those things that we can agree, and just possibly we will learn something by listening, learn something that might even improve us as a people and as a nation.
Thank you.
Yeah, this very much has to do with the Ptolemaic approach to what is important to America. I think Keith said it very eloquently. I would add that to the extent we can understand that all the issues that we face as a nation, for example, exist, occur, and are and will be important for us in Africa. In many ways, it is a problem of having devoted too few material and human resources into the African continent. Many would argue this applies as well for Latin America, and that is probably the case although I'll bet that we do pay more attention to Latin America than we do to Africa. And I would say that as this administration devotes more of its resources to development and diplomacy, as we have heard time and again, I will bet you've heard it today, that Africa will loom much larger on the horizon, on the radar scope, let's say, of the United States. And in terms when we actually listen to what concerns Africans, and for example, we talk about security. We know what we mean about security, and we tend to think that that's the same thing that other people think about for security. That is not, I can assure you, what Africans, how Africans would define security. It is not in the same ways we would define. So we do need to listen a lot more. And finally, I would say that in addition to diplomacy and development, the private sector can be the standard bearer, the leader in many ways into Africa that will help enlarge the attitudes and the resources of the United States toward the continent.
Yes, thank you. I think one way that you reach cultures that do not instinctively measure or understand ours is to use surrogates. That you do look for people on the ground who have exposure to the United States, people who have maybe through their education or their family background a better understanding of our culture as the mediators, so that you do not just send in people who may not understand the local culture. So you may need an intermediary. One of the things that we do as a think tank is to communicate with think tanks all around the world, where you do have centers of knowledge in the countries. In Africa, actually, quite a thriving community of small think tanks that can convey your messages. So I think that's definitely one of the ways that you do it. You do have to accept that you're not always your own best advocate. But in terms of Africa, I just wanted to say also that actually under the Bush administration, a lot more attention was paid to Africa than had been previously the case. More resources, more broadcasting, more diplomats. Africa, in fact, is one of the main recipients, I guess, of American international broadcasting at this point. So it's not, and if we do see more engagement with Africa, it will be part of a trend, not a complete break with what happened in the previous administration. And also, I would think that the election of Barack Obama in itself ought to facilitate a closer relationship. I don't know how you feel about it, but if I was African, I would certainly be excited by this development, and feel that there was now a stake in his presidency that had not otherwise been there. As far as Latin America is concerned, I think certainly we need to devote more resources to that part of the world that has been, unfortunately, a source of problems, a source of controversy on all sorts of fronts, drugs, immigration. We need to promote the more positive aspects of our relationship, and that has not been done as well as it should be for several decades.
Well, you know, as chair of a panel, you're always supposed to thank the panelists at the end, very performative, but I actually mean it very much here. I think it's been an extraordinarily interesting panel, really moved the subject along with a lot of good insights and practical steps. Thanks also to the audience for your questions. So please join me in thanking our panelists.
Thank you, Bruce. And I would remind you that we have some materials from Keith Reinhard that are on the table out there where the coffee was. So please pick them up on your way out. For those of you who are joining us at lunch for the speech by Stuart Baker, we will be dining starting through the line at 12:45. If you are not joining us for lunch, we'll be reconvening back here at 2:15. I want to remind you of the evaluation form in your materials. I honestly want to know what you have to say about the conference so we can make it better next year. So For those of you joining us for lunch, in about 10 minutes. If not, we'll see you back here at 2:15.